The first thing to remember about phrasal verbs is that 9 out of 10 times there is a non-phrasal synonym that you can use to express the same idea. So you can be a fluent speaker without learning and using all the phrasal verbs. Don't think that your English is better or more fluent if you say, "I've signed up for your course," instead of "I've enrolled on your course." The only reason you need to learn the common phrasal verbs is so you can understand native speakers, and the only way to learn them effectively for this purpose is by learning a few at a time and always in context. Memorizing lots of phrasal verbs from a list with their translation into your own language will only lead to confusion and frustration. Don't do it. So the strategy I recommend is, firstly, study a few in context and as part of a phrase. Secondly, revise all the ones you have learned before you study some new ones. And finally, listen out for them when you watch movies or have a conversation with a native speaker. This way you will gradually begin to use them yourself quite naturally. You just have to be patient. In this lesson, I'm going to explain some things you need to know about phrasal verbs that can help you to learn and assimilate them more easily. Once you have understood these important points about phrasal verbs, you can use the 10 lessons in my series called Phrasal Verbs in Daily English Conversations to gradually assimilate them. So when you're ready, let's begin this lesson on phrasal verbs.
Phrasal verbs. Let's start by looking at what a phrasal verb is. A phrasal verb is a verb that consists of a short verb, for example, go, come, get, take, and a preposition, also called an adverb or a particle, for example, up, down, in, on, etc. The preposition gives the verb a new meaning. For example, we have the verb come. We can add the preposition across and create a new verb, come across, which means to discover or encounter by chance. For example, I came across a nice souvenir shop yesterday. We can add the preposition round and create the verb come round, which is to visit someone at their home. She came round to have a look at the garden. So, how do we recognize a phrasal verb? Consider these two sentences with the verb come. First sentence, she came into the living room, which means she entered the living room. Second sentence, she came into a large sum of money when her uncle died, which means she inherited a large sum of money. In the first example, come into is not a phrasal verb because the preposition into has not changed the meaning of the verb come. You can call come into a place a prepositional verb, which is a verb that needs a preposition after it. Other examples of prepositional verbs are listen to, ask for, look at, depend on. However, come into money is a phrasal verb because its meaning is different from the original meaning of come. Come into money means inherit money. Now let's see if a phrasal verb can have different meanings. Indeed, some phrasal verbs have different meanings. We saw the verb come round, which meant visit someone at their home. But come round can also mean regain consciousness. That makes the context really important to understand these verbs. Okay, and the next question is, can different phrasal verbs have the same meaning? And the answer again is yes, some phrasal verbs are synonyms. So remember come round, which was to visit someone at their home. We can also say come around for the same idea, and even come over. They all mean visit someone at their home. The other meaning of come round, if you remember, was to regain consciousness. We can also say come around, and a synonym here would be come to. They all mean regain consciousness. Okay, let's move on to another question. Can a phrasal verb have a second preposition? Once again, the answer is yes. Some phrasal verbs need a second preposition. For example, he has come up with an interesting idea, which means he has suggested an interesting idea. They have come up against some problems, which means they have encountered some problems. These three-part verbs are called phrasal prepositional verbs. The first preposition is considered a particle or an adverb that changes the meaning of the verb, and the second preposition is needed before the object. The next question is, where do we use phrasal verbs? Phrasal verbs are common in spoken English, in formal correspondence such as emails, and semi-formal texts like blogs or newspaper articles. They are less common in formal written English, such as contracts and academic articles, where we usually use one-word verbs such as encounter and inherit. So an important question is, must I learn and use phrasal verbs? Well, most phrasal verbs have a non-phrasal synonym, or you can describe your idea using several other words. For example, you can come up with a solution or suggest a solution. Someone can come down with an illness or catch an illness. Therefore, you can still express yourself without phrasal verbs. Please don't think that your English is better or more fluent if you say, I've come down with a cold, instead of, I've caught a cold. However, it is important to know the common phrasal verbs in order to understand native speakers, who tend to use them frequently in their daily conversations and in formal writing. So the next important question is, what is the best way to learn these verbs? Phrasal verbs are like new vocabulary and expressions and need to be learned in context and within phrases. As with any other vocabulary item, it would be a waste of time to learn them through translation or by memorizing them from a list. So the strategy that I would recommend is, first of all, use material that teach phrasal verbs in context and as part of a phrase or a sentence. Secondly, make a note of the phrase you learn them in and write down the non-phrasal synonym, not the translation. Thirdly, look up the verb in an online dictionary and write at least one more usage example in your notes. So you'll have the verb with at least 2 example sentences and the non-phrasal synonym. No translation. Use your notes to revise them regularly, especially before studying some new ones. Also, look and listen out for these verbs when you read books or articles, or when you watch movies. Find new examples of how they're used. And finally, add any new examples that you see or hear, and of course, if you can remember them, to your original notes. This way, you will gradually begin to use them yourself quite naturally. You just have to be patient. And in the meantime, there is nothing wrong with using their one-word synonyms. Let's look at different types of phrasal verbs. The first type is intransitive phrasal verbs. So some phrasal verbs are intransitive. That means that they don't need an object. For example, come down, which means to decrease. The price of oil is coming down. Come out. That means to be released. This movie has just come out. These are intransitive phrasal verbs. Then we have transitive phrasal verbs. A transitive phrasal verb needs an object. Now, sometimes we can put this object between the verb and the preposition, and we call these separable verbs, and sometimes we cannot, and we call these inseparable verbs. So let's look at these two different types of transitive verbs, starting with inseparable ones. When a transitive phrasal verb is inseparable, the object, or the pronoun replacing the object, cannot come between the verb and the preposition. It must come after the preposition. For example, come across is an inseparable transitive verb. As you remember, it means discover or encounter by chance. I came across an old school friend in the park. You can never say, I came an old school friend across. Came and across have to stay together because this is an inseparable transitive verb. And if you use a pronoun, it's the same. I came across him in the park. You can never say, I came him across in the park. Note that three-part verbs, also called phrasal prepositional verbs, are always inseparable. Remember our example? He has come up with an interesting idea. He has suggested an interesting idea. He has come up with it. Right, let's look at separable transitive verbs. So when a transitive phrasal verb is separable, then the object can come between the verb and the preposition. For example, call off means cancel. We should call off these meetings. These meetings is the object, and because it is a separable transitive verb, we can put these meetings between call and off. We can separate the verb from the preposition. We should call these meetings off. Now be careful that if you replace the object by a pronoun, you must put the pronoun between the two parts. For example, should we call off these meetings? Yes, you should call them off. The pronoun must come between the two parts of the verb. You cannot say, yes, you should call off them. That doesn't work. Therefore, you do need to know if a transitive phrasal verb is separable or inseparable. If you're not sure whether it is separable or not, I have a small tip that you can follow. Ask yourself a question and produce a short answer with the preposition and the object. If it sounds correct to say the preposition before the object, then the verb is likely to be inseparable. For example, if the question is, who did he come across? And if you say, across an old school friend, this short answer sounds correct. Therefore, come across is an inseparable verb. She came across an old school friend. She came across him. However, if it sounds strange to say the preposition before the object, then the verb is likely to be separable. For example, what should we call off? And if you say off these meetings, the answer doesn't sound correct. It sounds incorrect. And therefore, call off is a separable verb. We should call these meetings off. Or we should call them off. Right, that's the end of this introductory lesson on phrasal verbs. Let's do some exercises. I'd like to review the phrasal verbs that you have seen in this lesson in new contexts. So, please complete each sentence with one of these prepositions. Across, down, into, off, over, out, round, to, and up are the prepositions I'd like you to insert into the following sentences. Number 1. She has come against some difficult issues. She has come up against some difficult issues. She has encountered, she has met some difficult issues. Number 2. If you're free, why don't you come for a cup of coffee? If you're free, why don't you come over, or why don't you come round for a cup of coffee? Why don't you come to my home for a cup of coffee? Number 3. That wasn't the first time he'd come. That proverb. That wasn't the first time he'd come across that proverb. That he had seen that proverb by chance. Number 4. We need to come with a better solution. We need to come up with a better solution. Suggest a better solution. Number 5. Because of extremely bad weather, they had to call the boat race. They had to call off the boat race. They had to cancel it. Number 6. She came a fortune when her aunt died. She came into a fortune when her aunt died. She inherited a fortune. Number 7. If you're surrounded by people with the flu, you'll come with it too. You'll come down with it too. You'll catch it too. Number 8. A few hours after the operation, he slowly came. He slowly came round, or he slowly came to. He slowly regained consciousness. Number 9. Do you think interest rates will come again? Do you think interest rates will come down again? Will decrease again? And finally, number 10. When is his new book coming? When is his new book coming out? When is his new book being released?